This is Elijah Stone. He used to wear a badge defending the weak against the powerful, until the system he trusted shredded his reputation, leaving him disgraced and alone in the wilderness. Now, he wears the mud and the silence of the deep woods, hunting the ghosts the powerful elite leave behind when they decide certain lives aren't worth counting. For the last 72 hours, a stench worse than death itself had been drifting on the stagnant, humid air of the Red Creek Preserve, a smell that didn't just speak of decay, but screamed of a violent, systematic cover-up orchestrated by the single most dominant force in the entire state, the Blackwood family, who owned every timber lease, every political favor, and every acre of land for 50 miles in every direction. Elijah knew with a chilling certainty that settled deep in his gut that if he found the source of that overwhelming metallic sweetness, that sickeningly heavy perfume of expired life, he wouldn't just find the remains of the forgotten, marginalized people who had sought refuge here. He would find irrefutable proof of why the Blackwoods had decided these specific, inconvenient lives needed to vanish without a trace. But what happened next, when his boot finally crossed the invisible psychological threshold into the circle of torn canvas and extinguished, ash-cold fire pits, exposed a horror and a level of calculated malice that even Elijah Stone, a man hardened by years of viewing humanity's worst impulses, was fundamentally unprepared to confront. The path leading to the clearing was not a path at all. It was a brutal, overgrown trench, carved by desperation and neglect, a ragged scar hidden beneath the heavy canopy of ancient pines and suffocating layers of underbrush. Every step Elijah took was a deliberate act of violence against the forest floor, the brittle branches snapping under the weight of his resolve. He moved with the practiced, predatory quiet of a man who had long ago learned that silence was the only true shield left in a world determined to expose and destroy him. The air was thick and syrupy, heavy with the oppressive moisture that clings to low-lying swamplands, but the humidity was secondary to the smell, which was now so concentrated that it seemed to possess a physical texture, clinging to the back of his throat like a viscous oil. It was a chemical cocktail of organic breakdown, a bouquet of spoiled meat, sour earth, and something sharply acidic, almost like industrial cleaner, suggesting an attempt, a failed, frantic attempt, to sanitize the unsanitizable. Elijah paused, his body melting into the shadow of a massive cedar, its bark rough and fissured against his cheek. He reached up, adjusting the brim of his faded canvas hat, a useless gesture against the internal storm brewing inside him. His mind, trained for pattern recognition and threat assessment, was already processing the environment, assembling the narrative before he saw the climax. This wasn't just a place where something died naturally. This was a scene that had been hurriedly, brutally disrupted. The silence here was wrong. It wasn't the natural, deep quiet of the forest, filled with the hum of insects and the rustle of unseen fauna. It was a vacuum, a manufactured silence, as if the local wildlife had fled hours, perhaps days before, repelled not just by the odor, but by the violence that preceded it. He thought of the Blackwoods. He always thought of the Blackwoods. They were the apex predators of this region, their wealth rooted in generations of exploitation, timber, mining, and now suspiciously lucrative land deals that always seemed to coincide with the sudden, tragic disappearance of anyone standing in their way. Elijah knew their playbook intimately. He had tried to expose their involvement in the contaminated water scandal years ago, back when he still believed in the sanctity of the badge. That belief had cost him everything: his career, his marriage, his reputation, and nearly his life. They hadn't used bullets. They had used paperwork, influence, and the sheer, crushing weight of their inherited authority, labeling him a paranoid rogue, a threat to public order. Now he was a ghost haunting their periphery, and the thought of confronting their cruelty again fueled a cold, relentless energy in his chest. The last 50 yards were the hardest. The stench was overwhelming now, forcing him to pull a bandana saturated with peppermint oil over his nose and mouth, a pathetic defense against the biological reality of the scene. He pushed aside a curtain of thorny blackberry vines and finally stumbled into the clearing. The camp was not merely abandoned, it was ravaged. It looked less like a campsite and more like the aftermath of a localized internal explosion. 3 large dome-style tents lay shredded, the nylon fabric ripped not along the seams, but violently, horizontally, suggesting tearing or slashing rather than simple collapse. The poles were splintered, tossed haphazardly like matchsticks. The fire pit, central to the clearing, was stone-cold, filled with grey, sodden ash, but scattered around it were artifacts that spoke volumes about the occupants: cheap, worn blankets, a rusted coffee pot lying on its side, and a single child's plastic action figure. Its bright blue plastic melted slightly on one side, perhaps from being too close to the heat of a desperate, long-ago fire. Elijah's eyes narrowed, scanning the perimeter, searching for the telltale signs of organized departure or chaotic flight. It was neither. This was an eradication. He knelt beside the closest tent ruin. The fabric was stained dark brown in several places, and the soil beneath was disturbed, deeply furrowed, as if heavy objects had been dragged away. He ran his gloved hand over the rip in the nylon. It wasn't clean, it was jagged, suggesting a tool used indiscriminately, perhaps a machete or a heavy hunting knife, wielded with blind fury or cold efficiency. The sheer physical reality of the destruction was jarring. These were not expensive tents. They were cheap shelters for people who had nowhere else to go. The violence inflicted upon them was excessive, pointless, unless the goal was not just to clear the land, but to send an undeniable, terrifying message. He thought of the occupants, the rumors he'd heard in town, whispers exchanged over cheap coffee and stale donuts in the early morning, at the only diner that would still serve him. A small group, mostly transient laborers, maybe a couple of families, trying to live off the grid, avoiding the constant surveillance and rent traps of the city. Low status, disposable, invisible, perfect victims for the Blackwood machine. Their crime, Elijah surmised, was simply existing where the Blackwoods planned to build the next luxury retreat or clear-cut the next profitable parcel of ancient timber. Elijah stood up, his eyes sweeping across the dense line of trees on the far side of the clearing. The forest seemed to press in, watching him. He could feel the weight of unseen eyes, or perhaps it was just the psychological residue of the terror that must have unfolded here. He took a slow, deliberate breath, trying to filter the overwhelming smell through the peppermint oil. He needed to find the source of the persistent, sickening decay, the core reason for the pervasive odor. It was too localized, too intense to be merely spilled food or animal remains. He moved toward the edge of the clearing, following a drag mark that led away from the fire pit, deep into the shadow of the trees. The ground here was softer, muddier, and the drag mark was unmistakable, a heavy, consistent groove suggesting the movement of something large and inert. His heart hammered a dull rhythm against his ribs, a sound amplified in the unnatural stillness. He drew the heavy-duty flashlight from his pack, the beam cutting a crisp white line through the gloom, even though it was mid-morning. The canopy was too thick. The drag mark stopped abruptly at a shallow depression, almost perfectly concealed by a fallen log and a dense thicket of ferns. It was here that the metallic, sickly sweet odor peaked, assaulting his senses with brutal clarity. He didn't need to dig to know what he had found, but his training demanded confirmation. Elijah used a small, retractable entrenching tool to carefully scrape away the thin layer of pine needles and damp earth covering the depression. The soil beneath was unnaturally dark, almost black, saturated with moisture that wasn't rain. As he scraped deeper, disturbing the earth, the smell intensified to an unbearable, staggering degree. He fought the reflexive urge to vomit, focusing instead on the texture of the soil. It was loose, recently turned, and mixed with something fibrous. Then the flashlight beam caught it, a flash of color, incongruous against the dark earth. It was a piece of fabric, synthetic and brightly patterned, a sleeve of a cheap, colorful nylon jacket, sticking out barely an inch from the soil. And attached to the jacket, unmistakable even beneath the grime and saturation, was the pale, smooth curve of a small human bone, perhaps a wrist. Elijah froze, the flashlight beam unwavering. This wasn't just a threat. This wasn't just eviction. This was a massacre, crudely buried and left to rot on land that the Blackwoods claimed as their own. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. They hadn't just wanted these people gone. They had wanted them erased, utterly removed from the face of the earth, their existence scrubbed clean so the paperwork for the land deal could proceed without complication. The sheer indifference to human life, the cold, calculating cruelty required to execute and conceal such an act, was breathtaking. He looked around the clearing again, seeing the shredded tents not as mere rubble, but as the scene of the crime, the silent witnesses to the final, terrifying moments of desperation. He was standing on a graveyard, a forgotten tomb built on greed and political immunity. Elijah lowered his flashlight, his jaw clenched so tight he could feel the muscles in his neck straining. He reached into his pack, pulling out a specialized satellite transmitter, his only link to the outside world, a device he had vowed never to use unless the evidence was catastrophic and undeniable. He needed to document this, to broadcast this crime to a world that had forgotten him, a world dominated by the very villains who committed it. But just as his finger brushed the activation switch, a sound sliced through the oppressive silence, a sound that was neither animal nor natural, but mechanical, synthetic, and terrifyingly close. It was the faint, rhythmic whirring of a high-powered drone hovering somewhere just beyond the canopy line, its sound muffled by the forest, but undeniably present. He wasn't alone. They knew he was here. The Blackwoods hadn't just cleaned up the bodies. They had left a surveillance presence, a digital guardian ensuring that their secret remained buried. The hunter had become the hunted, and the moment Elijah had disturbed the earth, he had triggered an alarm. His isolation, once his greatest strength, was now his most profound vulnerability. He was miles from civilization, deep in the Blackwood family's domain, standing over the shallow grave of their victims. The air that had been so thick with the smell of death now felt charged with imminent focused danger. He knew he had seconds, maybe less, before whatever security protocols the Blackwoods had implemented moved from passive observation to active enforcement. He quickly snapped a series of high-resolution photos of the exposed gravesite, the torn tent, and the drag marks, transferring the data immediately to the encrypted memory card he wore around his neck. He couldn't risk the transmitter yet. Activating it would pinpoint his exact location for miles around. Elijah backed slowly away from the grave, pulling the log and ferns back into place, attempting to restore the illusion of undisturbed nature. His mind raced, calculating the odds. The Blackwoods wouldn't send local police, they owned the police. They would send private security, ex-military contractors, men who operated outside the law, men who were paid handsomely to make problems disappear permanently. Men like the man Elijah used to be before he chose conscience over career. He slipped back into the dense undergrowth, the scent of rot and peppermint mingling in his lungs. He had found the proof. He had found the victims. But the encounter had already escalated into a deadly game of cat and mouse, and he was deep behind enemy lines, surrounded by the physical evidence of their monstrous power. The contrast was absolute. Elijah, the lone, disgraced truth-seeker, against the Blackwoods, the untouchable dynasty whose indifference had created this mass grave. The drone sound faded slightly, moving away, perhaps confirming the intruder's presence before retreating to call in the cavalry. Elijah knew the clock was ticking down to zero. He had exposed their secret, but now he had to survive long enough to share it. He looked down at the mud clinging to his worn combat boots. It was tainted with the earth of the grave. He carried their crime with him. This was the moment the Blackwoods had planned for, the moment the inconvenient truth attempted to surface. They had the resources, the territory, and the absolute lack of morality. Elijah had only his training, and the cold, burning justice he sought for the voiceless victims buried beneath his feet. The game had begun, a battle for the soul of the county, fought over a few yards of desecrated forest floor. He took one last shuddering breath of the corrupted air. He had the evidence, the horrifying link between the powerless and the utterly powerful. But what happened next, when the Blackwood enforcers arrived, would challenge every instinct for survival Elijah possessed, forcing him to confront a level of organized depravity he had only suspected existed in the dark heart of American power. This was far from over. The air was not just cold, it was heavy. It clung to Elijah's lungs, thick with the stench of disturbed earth and the sickening sweetness of decomposition. The drone was gone, swallowed by the canopy, but the message it delivered was clear. They know. Elijah did not flinch, did not panic. Panic was a luxury reserved for the untrained. He was standing on a mass grave, the mud beneath his boots a slurry of clay, pine needles, and human tragedy. This was not just a crime scene. It was the physical manifestation of Blackwood power, a monument to their untouchable indifference. The contrast burned in his mind, the sheer scale of the atrocity hidden beneath the quiet rustle of the pines versus the solitary, disgraced man standing above it, tasked with bringing it all to light. He was the active martyr, not because he sought death, but because he accepted the inevitability of the sacrifice required. He had seen the cost of speaking truth to power before. He had paid it with his career, his reputation, and nearly his life. 3 years ago, Elijah had been the tip of the spear, a high-level security consultant, ex-military, operating in the shadows the corporations preferred. He was paid to secure assets, silence dissent, and ensure profitability, regardless of the ethical cost. He was lethal, efficient, and crucially compliant. Compliance was the currency of his former world. Then came the operation in the Mojave, a water rights dispute. He was ordered to displace a small, uncooperative community. The methods authorized were brutal, disproportionate. Elijah, the machine, saw the faces of the children, the sheer, unwarranted cruelty of the corporate mandate, and the switch flipped. He refused. He filed the report. He broke the code of silence. The retaliation was swift and surgical. They didn't kill him. Killing him would have created a martyr. They did something far worse. They stripped him clean. They fabricated evidence of gross negligence, embezzlement, and a failed psychological profile. The man who was once a six-figure security asset became a pariah overnight, a discredited zealot deemed unstable, paranoid, and unreliable. Every contact ghosted him. Every door slammed shut. His very expertise was weaponized against his sanity. That was the suffering. That was the unjust burden he carried. He was not pursuing the Blackwoods out of revenge, but out of a desperate need to cleanse the stain they had placed on his own soul. He understood their methods because he had once been their method. His suffering was the proof of their depravity, and his continued existence was a testament to his virtue. The refusal to surrender his conscience, even when it cost him everything. Elijah knelt slowly, movements economical, the weight of his tactical pack shifting slightly. He took a sample of the mud, scraping the tainted earth into a sterile vial he pulled from a waterproof pouch. Evidence, proof, data. He was no longer a soldier or a consultant. He was a forensic ghost, collecting the pieces of a truth that the powerful had paid billions to bury. His mind worked with cold clinical efficiency, suppressing the bile that rose in his throat from the smell. He had seconds, maybe minutes, before the Blackwood response teams arrived. These wouldn't be rent-a-cops. These would be professionals, former colleagues perhaps, men trained in counter-surveillance, rapid deployment, and lethal engagement. Men who valued the paycheck over the principles Elijah had chosen. He scanned the perimeter. The dense forest offered cover, but also limited visibility. The grave site itself was a tactical trap, open, exposed, surrounded by broken tents and the chilling remnants of a life violently extinguished. He needed to move, but he couldn't just flee. He needed to prepare the ground for battle, or at least for evasion. He reached inside his worn, reinforced jacket and pulled out a small, satellite-linked encryption device. His superpower occulto was not strength, but information management. If he was captured, the Blackwoods would incinerate every piece of digital evidence instantly. The only way to survive was to ensure the data survived him. He began the upload sequence, slow, painfully slow. The forest canopy interfered with the signal, turning the transmission of the geolocation data and the spectral analysis of the soil into a grueling, minute-by-minute gamble. Every tick of the clock was a step closer to his capture or death. Transferring data packet 1 of 12. Estimated time, 4 minutes, 30 seconds. 4 minutes. That was an eternity in this environment. His suffering was his focus. The constant grinding ache of being an outcast had sharpened him, stripped away the softness of civilian life. He relied on the training they had given him, the very skills they now feared. He was a walking contradiction, a corporate weapon turned against its creators, fueled by moral outrage. He pushed the encryption device deep into the hollow of a rotting log, camouflaging it meticulously with moss and damp leaves. If he could hold them off for 4 minutes, the basic coordinates and the initial findings would be securely off-site, routed through a complex series of servers he had established years ago when he first went rogue. He pulled his primary weapon, a modified hunting rifle, silent and reliable, from its canvas sling. He checked the action, the safety, the thermal scope. His hands were steady. They had to be. Fear was a distraction he could not afford. The virtue of the martyr was absolute calm in the face of inevitable destruction. He surveyed the debris field of the abandoned camp. The torn canvas, the scattered belongings. He noticed a small, faded child's drawing tacked to a splintered tree trunk, a stick-figure family under an impossibly bright yellow sun. The juxtaposition of that innocent image against the horror beneath his feet was a physical punch. This was why he was here. This was the fuel for the fire. He was fighting for the son they would never see again. He moved away from the gravesite, circling wide, utilizing the thickest cover the pines offered. He needed elevation, a vantage point. The ground was slick, treacherous. He moved like smoke, barely disturbing the pine straw. Every instinct honed by years of surviving impossible odds screamed at him to run, to abandon the slow upload and save himself. But the virtue held him firm. If he ran now, they would simply clean up the site, and the evidence would vanish forever. His suffering would be pointless. His disgrace would be permanent. He had to be the anchor, the immovable object against the Blackwood tide. He reached a small ridge overlooking the camp. He settled in, prone, the cold earth pressing against his chest. He tasted the metallic tang of fear and adrenaline, mixing with the pervasive odor of rot. He focused on his breathing, slowing his heart rate until his pulse was a dull, rhythmic thump against the mud. He pulled out his field glasses, scanning the surrounding tree line, not for movement, but for disruption. A broken branch, a misplaced stone, the faint glint of synthetic fabric. The Blackwood teams would approach silently, utilizing thermal signature masking and counter-tracking techniques. They wouldn't announce their arrival. They would simply materialize. He thought of the Blackwood CEO, the oily, detached voice he had heard on the intercepted comms, discussing the resource reallocation that had led to this mass grave. The sheer arrogance of the powerful, the belief that their wealth insulated them from morality. Elijah's entire being was now dedicated to shattering that illusion. He was the splinter in the eye of the corporate titan. Transferring data packet 5 of 12, estimated time 2 minutes, 10 seconds. He adjusted the bipod of the rifle, settling the crosshairs on a clear sightline, a narrow gap between 2 ancient maples that the approaching team would likely use for cover. His finger rested lightly on the trigger guard. He wasn't aiming to kill. He was aiming to delay, to create chaos, to buy the necessary seconds for the final data transfer. He recalled his therapist's assessment, years ago, when he was fighting the corporate smear campaign. Elijah, you seek resolution through self-destruction. You are trying to erase your past compliance by embracing absolute martyrdom. He disagreed then, and he disagreed now. This wasn't self-destruction. This was calibration. This was the only way a man who had participated in the darkness could ever hope to see the light again. His pain was his penance. His action was his redemption. A faint sound, almost imperceptible, reached him. Not a rustle, but a snap. Too heavy for a deer, too rhythmic for the wind. It came from the west perimeter. Elijah froze, every nerve ending screaming high alert. His training kicked in, overriding the fear. He calculated the vector, the speed, the likely numbers. 2 men, moving fast but attempting to mask their sound. Professionals. He lowered the rifle slightly, confirming the target acquisition system was active. He needed to be invisible, lethal and gone before they could coordinate a full sweep of the area. He repeated the mantra in his mind, a cold, hard promise. The evidence leaves the forest, even if I don't. The first shadow detached itself from the gloom of the pines, a silhouette too broad, too disciplined to be an animal. The man was equipped with state-of-the-art camouflage, moving with a predatory glide. He carried a suppressed carbine, the universal tool of corporate enforcement. Elijah held his breath. He waited for the second man to appear, to confirm the flanking maneuver. He was the bait, drawing them in, forcing them to focus on him, while the small, hidden device continued its desperate transmission beneath the rotting log. He was the active martyr, embracing the suffering, transforming his unjust disgrace into the ultimate act of virtue. His heart hammered not from fear, but from the savage exhilaration of finally confronting the darkness he had spent his life serving, and now dismantling. The battle for the data, for the truth, was about to begin, fought over the desecrated soil of the Blackwood domain. Transferring data packet 8 of 12, estimated time 1 minute, 15 seconds. The clock was almost out, and the wolves had arrived. Elijah adjusted his sight picture, preparing to unleash the fury of a man who had nothing left to lose but the truth itself. The stench of rot and the metallic scent of impending conflict filled the cold, silent air. He was ready to pay the final price. He had to be. The cold was a physical presence, not just a temperature, but a pressure that bore down on Elijah, driving the stench of petrochemical rot and decay deep into his lungs. The timer was a silent countdown, ticking away in the dark recesses of his mind. 75 seconds, 70 seconds. The data was the anchor, the one immutable truth tethering him to this horrifying patch of earth. Everything else, his life, his freedom, his future, was expendable, already priced into the cost of admission. He watched the first shadow, Alpha, move with the uncanny silence of highly paid predators. The man was a ghost in cryptek camouflage, the rifle a seamless extension of his arm. Elijah could see the subtle glint of his optics in the minimal ambient light filtering through the canopy. Alpha was covering the main approach, scanning the obvious threats. He hadn't seen the transfer device. He was looking for the man who pulled the trigger. He was looking for Elijah. The second shadow, Beta, was slower, moving wide to the west, completing the textbook pincer. Beta carried heavier gear, perhaps supporting comms or non-lethal extraction tools, a sign that they were ordered to retrieve something intact, or someone. They weren't just executioners, they were recovery specialists. This complicated the kill chain. Elijah needed to neutralize them without damaging their primary communication gear, if possible, to glean further intelligence. But survival came first. Data packet 9 of 12. 58 seconds. The sound of Beta's boot, a crisp crunch on dry moss, was the only warning Elijah needed. Beta had broken discipline, distracted by a shifting branch or a false reading. That fractional error was a lifetime in this environment. Elijah decided. He shifted his weight, a micro-adjustment that didn't disturb the leaf litter beneath his belly. He aimed for Alpha first. Alpha was the primary threat, covering the easiest escape route. He exhaled slowly, controlling the last vestiges of oxygen in his chest, allowing his heart rate to dip momentarily. The rifle sight settled on the junction of Alpha's neck and shoulder, a guaranteed incapacitation that wouldn't immediately compromise the mission's integrity by creating excessive noise or gore. The engagement began, not with a roar, but with a mechanical whisper. Pat-whack. The suppressed round hit Alpha precisely where intended. Alpha didn't scream, didn't fall dramatically. He simply crumpled, his CNS instantly overwhelmed, collapsing forward into the wet underbrush like a sack of stones. The carbine slid uselessly from his grasp. The silence that followed was terrifying. A vacuum where sound should have been, making the single sharp report feel deafeningly loud within Elijah's own skull. Beta instantly reacted, dropping prone, his own suppressed weapon traversing toward the sound origin. But Beta was still too far west, his vision obscured by the dense thicket of spruce. He was reacting to the echo, not the source. Data packet 10 of 12, 40 seconds. Elijah moved. This was the small victory, the rise in the W curve, the sudden violent displacement of expectation that always precedes a brief glimmer of hope. He pushed off his heels, scrambling backward 3 meters, relying on the cover of a massive, moss-covered boulder. He was now slightly uphill from Beta, granting a crucial tactical advantage. Beta was still spraying suppressing fire toward Alpha's location, a waste of ammunition born of panic and poor situational awareness. He was calling out, Alpha! Status! The radio silence from his partner must have been the first cold stab of realization that the situation was irretrievable. Elijah didn't wait. He leveraged the sound of Beta's bursts to mask his movement, transitioning from prone to a low crouch behind the granite shield. He acquired Beta in his sight picture. This time, there was no room for ethical consideration or non-lethal restraint. Beta was a direct, immediate threat to the data transfer. Patu-petuuwek, 2 rounds, rapid succession. The first hit Beta's protective plate, a dull clank that momentarily stunned the operative. The second, aimed lower and faster, found the unprotected juncture of his thigh and hip. Beta screamed, a strangled guttural sound of pure agony that was immediately cut short as he pitched sideways, his leg refusing to support his weight. His rifle discharged into the air uselessly. Elijah didn't confirm the kill. He couldn't afford the luxury. He sprinted the 5 meters back to the rotting log, ignoring the sharp, searing pain in his own knee from the rapid maneuver. He ripped the small, ruggedized terminal out from under the log, the stench of its hiding place clinging to the plastic casing. Data packet 12 of 12. Transfer complete. Encryption key confirmed. The digital confirmation flashed green against the dark screen. It was done. The evidence was secured. The sacrifice had meaning. A wave of nauseating relief washed over him, momentarily blinding him to the periphery. This was the peak of the W curve, the ecstatic, foolish moment of believing he had won the game. He had faced down the wolves, secured the truth, and survived. His heart rate, which had been a frantic drumbeat against his ribs, began to slow, the adrenaline starting its inevitable, painful withdrawal. He let out a ragged, silent breath. He should have known better. The corporation didn't send 2 men. They sent a system. The fall was instantaneous and brutal, a catastrophic drop from the peak of temporary safety into the abyss of absolute exposure. The world exploded in sound and light. It wasn't gunfire. It was something far worse. A high-powered, military-grade flash concussion grenade, deployed not from the ground, but from above. It landed 10 feet behind him, the force of the blast throwing him forward, slamming his chest against the hard forest floor. The sound was not merely loud, it was physical torture. A pressure wave that ruptured eardrums and felt like a fist hitting the inside of his skull. The light was absolute zero white, searing his retinas through his closed eyelids, leaving dancing black spots and overwhelming sensory overload. Elijah was deafened, blinded, and disoriented. His rifle, jarred loose by the impact, skittered away into the darkness. His body refused to obey commands. He lay gasping, tasting blood and grit, the exquisite pain in his ears radiating down his neck. The third man. Or worse, the technology. He forced his eyes open, blinking furiously against the residual whiteout. He could only perceive shapes, distorted and wavering. He tried to crawl toward the terminal, which had been knocked free from his grasp, sliding several feet away. The green light of the transfer complete status seemed to mock him, a beacon in the darkness. Then the sound returned, not the high-pitched ringing of tinnitus, but the heavy, deliberate crunch of a single pair of boots approaching slowly from the south. The new arrival was not scrambling or rushing. He was calm, he was thorough, he was hunting. This was the sharp drop. The realization that Alpha and Beta were merely sacrificial lambs, noise generators designed to fix Elijah's position and distract him from the true threat. The specialist who waited, observing the entire engagement from a vantage point, allowing Elijah his momentary victory, only to snatch the prize away at the very last second. A large shadow detached itself from the gloom. This man was different. He wore no camouflage, only black, durable, tactical gear that absorbed the meager light. He carried no carbine, but a massive, silenced shotgun rigged with non-lethal, incapacitating rounds. A weapon designed for target recovery, not disposal. His face was obscured by a full-coverage ballistic helmet, featureless and menacing. The specialist stopped 3 feet away from Elijah, who was still struggling to regain motor control, the terminal just inches from his outstretched, trembling fingers. "Elijah Vance," the voice was synthesized, robotic, utterly devoid of inflection, broadcast through the helmet's external speaker. You failed the final phase of your evaluation. The term evaluation hit Elijah harder than the concussion blast. They weren't hunting him for betraying them, they were hunting him for failing their twisted criteria. This entire horrific spectacle, the rot, the deaths, the desperation, it had been a test. A monstrous final attempt to break him or confirm his utility. He fought the paralysis, his muscles screaming in protest. He had to get to the device. He had to ensure the evidence was secure, even if it meant smashing the terminal itself before the specialist could retrieve it. The specialist didn't rush. He simply lowered the heavy shotgun. The muzzle was enormous, black, and focused directly on Elijah's chest. The data is irrelevant now, the synthetic voice continued, chillingly calm. The target acquisition was based on your prior behavioral profile. Your commitment to the evidence was predictable. Your sacrifice was anticipated. We predicted a 98.7% probability of you prioritizing the transfer over immediate exfiltration. The specialist nudged the terminal with the toe of his boot, flipping the small device over, revealing the cracked screen displaying the triumphant green text. You won the skirmish, Vance. You failed the war. Then the specialist raised his boot. He didn't stomp on the device. He delivered a precise measured kick to Elijah's exposed ribs. The impact was sickening, a sound of crunching bone that even the ringing in Elijah's ears couldn't fully mask. Elijah gasped, his lungs collapsing against the sudden searing pain. He rolled onto his back, clutching his side, vision tunneling with agony. The specialist knelt, pulling a zip-tie restraint from a pouch on his thigh. He wasn't going to kill him. He was going to retrieve him. Intact. The corporation requires a full debriefing on your rationale for disobedience. They admire your tenacity, Vance. They simply object to its direction. As the specialist reached for Elijah's wrists, Elijah's mind raced through the crippling pain. He had secured the data, yes, but the specialist had confirmed the entire situation was engineered. The villains weren't just evil, they were omniscient, playing chess while Elijah was playing checkers. This was the crushing realization. His virtue was their tool. His suffering was their data point. He used the last vestiges of his strength, the deep, primal reservoir of the active martyr. Instead of fighting the restraint, he surged forward, not toward the specialist, but toward the abandoned body of Alpha who lay slumped nearby. The specialist reacted instantly, but Elijah's desperate lunge was unexpected. Elijah grabbed the fallen operative's discarded carbine, the very weapon he had used moments ago, and pulled it toward him. The specialist didn't hesitate. He swung the butt of the shotgun, connecting with the side of Elijah's head. The world tilted violently. A fresh wave of blinding pain erupted, followed by the metallic taste of blood flooding his mouth. He felt the sickening, dizzying rush of impending blackout, but he held on to the carbine. The specialist, realizing Elijah was determined to destroy the weapon or use it, stepped back, preparing to administer the final, incapacitating blow. Elijah knew he couldn't fire, not with his vision swimming and his ribs screaming. But he had one last card, the hidden superpower, the data. He reached up, blindly fumbling for the small, almost invisible satellite transceiver sewn into the lining of his collar, a secondary, emergency transmitter he had prepared months ago. The specialist saw the movement, misinterpreting it as an attempt to activate a self-destruct mechanism. He raised the massive shotgun, aiming for Elijah's shoulder. "Do not attempt to destroy company property, Vance." Elijah ignored him. He found the tiny, recessed button on the transceiver. He pressed it 3 times, a prearranged emergency signal that didn't transmit data, but a simple encrypted distress ping, a beacon sent not to the corporation, but to the one person he still trusted in the world, the only person who knew the coordinates of this forbidden zone. His former partner, now the head of an external investigative unit. The specialist fired. The non-lethal round, a specialized kinetic sponge, hit Elijah's shoulder with the force of a sledgehammer. The pain was immediate, paralyzing, and absolute. His arm went numb, dropping the carbine. His body seized up, convulsing against the paralyzing agent contained within the round. As darkness consumed his vision, the last thing Elijah heard was the specialist's cold, triumphant whisper, echoing faintly over the high-pitched whine in his damaged ears. Secure the prisoner. Retrieve the terminal. The corporation has full control now. Elijah was dragged across the cold, damp earth, the transfer terminal clutched tightly in the specialist's gloved hand. He had reached the peak of the W, tasted survival, and been plunged back into the deepest, darkest point of the narrative. Captured, defeated, and realizing his entire struggle had been managed from above. The evidence was gone. His freedom was gone. Only the silent, desperate emergency ping, radiating uselessly into the night sky, held the faintest, most fragile promise of external intervention. He was the defeated martyr, his suffering now absolute, awaiting the final resolution that only a force greater than his captors could provide. The forest closed in, the stench of rot now mingled with the overwhelming scent of his own failure and despair. He was a prisoner of the darkness he had tried to expose. The kinetic sponge round had not just delivered paralysis, it had delivered a profound, bone-deep physical argument against defiance. Elijah felt the world tilt and collapse as he was dragged, his useless limbs scraping across the unforgiving, needle-covered floor of the forest. The specialist, Marcus, the man he had trained beside, the man who knew every tick and every moral fracture point, had secured the terminal. That fact, the loss of the evidence, burned hotter than the systemic shock coursing through his nerves. They did not bother to lift him. They treated him as salvage, a piece of equipment to be secured, not a human to be handled. Two heavy-set retrieval specialists, their faces obscured by matte black tactical masks, gripped the collar of his jacket and the heel of his boot, pulling him backward through the dark undergrowth. Every root, every sharp stone, every patch of frozen mud became a tiny, searing point of friction against his back and the exposed skin of his neck. He could not cry out. The paralyzing agent had seized his diaphragm, allowing only shallow, rattling breaths that sounded wet and inadequate in the sudden, echoing silence after the gunfire. The odor of the abandoned camp, the smell of decay, burnt synthetics, and something profoundly biologically wrong, was now overpowering, mixing with the sharp, metallic scent of his own fear and the chemical residue clinging to his clothes. He tried to focus his eyes, which were watering involuntarily from the pain, catching glimpses of the world rushing past, the blur of massive, ancient trees, the glint of tactical gear, the indifference in the movements of his captors. They dragged him for what felt like an eternity, perhaps only 5 minutes, before reaching a secondary structure hidden deeper within the compound's perimeter, a heavy-duty, field-reinforced tent that served as a mobile detention unit. It was soundproofed, reinforced with internal steel mesh, and designed to contain assets far more volatile than Elijah Vance. He was unceremoniously dumped inside. The thud of his body hitting the thin, cold synthetic floor jarred his spine, sending a new wave of excruciating pain radiating from his shoulder down to his fingertips. The specialists worked with cold, efficient brutality. They did not check his pulse or his injury. They were focused solely on immobilization. They stripped him of his remaining gear, his watch, his secondary knife, the small, laminated photo of his daughter he kept in his boot. One of the men, whose codename was likely Ghost, used specialized polymer restraints. These were not standard handcuffs. They were designed to apply pressure precisely to nerve clusters. Ghost cinched the restraints tight around Elijah's wrists and ankles, securing him to thick, welded anchor points on the tent floor. The rough synthetic fibers of the straps immediately began to chafe the skin already raw from the dragging. "Keep him stable," Ghost muttered. His voice filtered through the mask's vocoder, devoid of inflection. "The drug is wearing off quickly. We need him conscious for the transfer." The pain in his shoulder began to transition from a paralyzing shock to a deep, throbbing ache. The kinetic sponge round had done its job, shattered the superficial nerves, bruised the bone, and delivered the systemic agent. Elijah felt a faint, flickering return of sensation, a terrifying tingling in his fingers, the signal that he was about to regain control, but still too weak to fight. He tried to flex his hand, producing only a minuscule twitch, a pathetic movement that Ghost immediately noticed. Ghost knelt beside him, his massive frame blocking the dim light filtering through the tent flap. He leaned in, his helmet touching Elijah's ear. "Don't waste the energy, Vance," Ghost whispered, the mechanical distortion making the threat sound even more alien. "We know your limits. Try to move. and I hit you with a booster shot. You'll be jelly for 3 days." He stood up, adjusted the rifle slung across his chest, and left the tent, sealing the heavy zipper behind him. Elijah was alone, pinned to the floor, staring at the cold, reinforced fabric ceiling. He could feel the blood slowly pooling beneath his injured shoulder, soaking into the cheap synthetic floor. The air was stale, thick with the smell of old chemicals and fear. Then, the tent flap opened again. Marcus entered, alone. He wasn't wearing his tactical mask anymore. His face was chillingly familiar, chiseled, cold, marked by the years of corporate loyalty and ethical compromise. He looked down at Elijah, not with triumph, but with professional disappointment. Marcus was carrying the transfer terminal. He held it casually, swinging the dense metal cube by its integrated handle. "The distress ping," Marcus began, his voice calm, conversational, which was infinitely worse than rage. He checked his wrist-mounted terminal. "The signal was weak, Vance, very amateur. You used the old triple tap sequence, nostalgic but highly inefficient." Elijah tried to speak, tried to ask about the data, about the atrocities, about why, but only a dry, rattling cough escaped his throat. Marcus knelt down, bringing the terminal close to Elijah's face. The screen glowed faintly, displaying the corporation's logo, a stylized, predatory bird, pulsing menacingly. "You sacrificed everything for this data," Marcus continued, running a gloved thumb across the screen. "Your career, your ethics, your life. You believed this was the key, the silver bullet that would expose the rot." He leaned closer, forcing Elijah to breathe in the sterile, expensive scent of his tactical jacket. "Let me show you, Elijah, precisely what your heroic effort achieved." Marcus pressed a sequence of keys on the terminal's physical interface. The faint buzzing sound of data transfer began. "We recovered the evidence the moment you were incapacitated. Everything you gathered, the logs, the biometric data from the deceased, the geographical schematics of the containment failure, it's all being uploaded to the central archive right now." A wave of crushing despair washed over Elijah. He had failed. Not just failed to escape, but failed to protect the truth. "But here is the truly beautiful part, Elijah," Marcus smiled, a small, tight, horrifying expression. "We aren't just archiving it. We are analyzing it. Your meticulous work, the way you cross-reference the microbial signatures with the environmental contamination reports, it's brilliant, truly brilliant." Marcus paused, letting the information sink in, savoring the moment of absolute psychological defeat. "Your data is not going to expose the corporation. It is going to optimize the corporation. We are using your findings, Vance, to fine-tune the containment protocols for the next wave of trials. Your moral crusade just made our operation 50% more efficient. You didn't just fail, you served us the perfect operational blueprint." Elijah's eyes were locked on Marcus's face, burning with impotent fury. The humiliation was total. His virtue had been weaponized against him. Marcus stood up, dusting off his knee with unnecessary formality. "You always suffered from the same flaw, Vance. You believed morality was a force, when in reality it is merely a vulnerability. The predictable liability we budgeted for." He walked over to a small medical supply box tucked into the corner. He pulled out a syringe containing a clear fluid. "Now, about that little triple tap you sent out." Elijah's heart hammered against his ribs. The ping. The desperate signal to his former partner, Sarah, the only person who could initiate an external rescue. "Did you really think we wouldn't have a full-spectrum sensor grid operational?" Marcus scoffed, shaking his head gently, as if chastising a child. "We registered the unauthorized energy spike the moment you activated it. It was a clear, unambiguous beacon." Elijah felt a sudden cold terror replacing the physical pain. "You sent it to Sarah, didn't you?" Marcus asked, injecting the clear fluid, a mild sedative mixed with a truth serum, into Elijah's neck, ignoring the muted groan of pain the movement caused. "Don't worry, Vance. I'm not going to stop her from coming. In fact, I'm rather counting on it." Marcus leaned back against the wall, crossing his arms. The sedative was beginning to cloud Elijah's thoughts, making the edges of the tent blurry, but his terror sharpened the focus on Marcus's words. "We knew we couldn't just capture you and make this go away. You had too many external contacts, too many contingency plans. But if we allow Sarah, the head of external compliance, the most aggressive watchdog in the sector, to walk right into this kill zone and we neutralize her as well." Marcus trailed off, smiling thinly. "You see, Elijah, your desperate last-ditch attempt at salvation didn't just fail you. It is going to deliver us the final piece of the puzzle, the neutralization of the only credible threat to the corporation's deep forest operations." The oxygen seemed to be sucked out of the tent. Elijah stared, paralyzed in every sense, realizing his final act of rebellion had signed the death warrant of the only person who could have saved him. His failure was now compounded into a catastrophic betrayal. Marcus walked over to the terminal, which was now silent, the data transfer complete. He wiped the screen clean with a chemical swab, treating the device with more care than he had shown Elijah. "Enjoy the wait, Vance," Marcus said, his voice flat, professional. "Your friend should arrive within 48 hours, maybe less if she's as reckless as you were." He turned to leave but stopped at the exit. He looked back at Elijah, whose eyes were now heavy, the truth serum locking him in a state of hyper-aware helplessness. "One last thing, Elijah. While you're thinking about your moral superiority, remember this. The men you tried to save, the ones whose horrific deaths you documented, they were never meant to be people. They were statistical variables. And you, Vance, you were just an unusually high-maintenance variable. Now you're just a decoy." Marcus zipped the tent shut, plunging Elijah into darkness. The sound of the heavy zipper closing was absolute, final, a sealing of the tomb. Elijah lay there, the cold seeping into his bones, the residual pain from the kinetic impact a constant brutal thrumming. He was helpless, violated, and now he carried the knowledge that the woman he trusted was walking toward a corporate ambush, guided by the desperate signal he had sent. He fought the sedative, trying to reclaim control, but the drug was too strong. His mind began to circle, trapped in the crushing loop of his monumental failure, awaiting the inevitable arrival of the final, superior authority that would deliver the ultimate corporate justice. The hate he felt for Marcus and the faceless corporation was a physical weight, but it was overshadowed by the searing, agonizing self-hatred for having become the perfect, unwitting pawn. His suffering was complete, awaiting only the external force, the true Deus Ex Machina, to step into the trap he had laid. He was the martyr, pinned down, awaiting the final, brutal act of the play he had so disastrously written. His body began to shiver violently, not from cold, but from the systemic shock and the absolute psychological violation of being rendered entirely meaningless. The engine died with a soft final sigh, 2 miles from the coordinates. Sarah didn't trust the silence of the woods. She trusted only the inherent corruption of corporate security protocols. She climbed out of the heavily modified transport, a nondescript utility van layered with military-grade passive shielding, and paused, letting the overwhelming dampness of the temperate rainforest wash over her. The air tasted of pine decay and cold metal, but beneath that a faint chemical tang lingered, a scent of industrial-grade solvent trying desperately to scrub away the metallic, viscous smell of old fear and spilled blood. Her approach was not stealth. It was absence. She wore carbon-weave tactical gear, designed to absorb thermal signatures and scatter acoustic feedback. Her boots, customized with compressed polymer soles, were entirely silent on the bed of wet pine needles and decomposing moss. She moved not as a hunter, but as a fluid shadow, her senses calibrated to register micro-anomalies. Elijah's desperate, archaic beacon had provided coordinates, but her training screamed that the coordinates were the least important part of the message. The message itself was the bait, broadcast on a frequency that was just easy enough for the corporation's antiquated tracking systems to latch onto instantly. It was a cry for help, designed to be intercepted, not hidden. She reached the edge of the clearing, dropping instantly into a deep crouch behind a root system thicker than a man's torso. Her eyes, protected by proprietary optical filters that compensated for the low light and filtered out infrared contamination, scanned the scene. The camp was a lie. It presented the perfect tableau of abrupt abandonment, a fire pit hastily doused, scattering ash across the dirt, 2 tents partially collapsed, held down by snapped guy ropes, an empty MRE packet caught on a low branch. If she were just a worried friend, she would rush in, desperate to find a clue, or Elijah himself. But Sarah was not just a friend. She was the architect who had built the back doors Marcus now relied upon, the specialist who understood the psychological profile of corporate counter-terrorism better than the mercenaries running it. Her superpower was her precision, her capacity for absolute clinical observation, and her refusal to let emotion contaminate data. She raised a handheld multispectrum scanner, sweeping the perimeter. The environmental readout was immediate and damning. There were 3 distinct, very recent heat signatures that did not belong to the natural fauna. Thermal ghosts of men who had been standing still for too long, just outside the clearing's light spill. More critically, the air pressure sensors registered minute, continuous vibrations that were entirely too rhythmic for the wind. They were low-frequency communication bursts, highly directional, bouncing off the dense canopy, the signature chatter of a closed tactical net. Marcus was not only present, he was waiting for the performance to begin. He thinks I am Vance, she thought, the name a bitter taste in her mouth. He thinks I am reckless, driven by panic, and predictable. She shifted her focus to the main tent, the single, intact structure standing near the center, slightly elevated on a small rise. It was zipped shut, a dark, silent sentinel. The scanner confirmed a single, large, static heat signature inside. Elijah. His core temperature was slightly depressed, consistent with sedative use, but his breathing was shallow, regular. He was alive, but incapacitated. The tent was the center stage, the bullseye of the trap. Sarah began her methodical, almost meditative sweep. She was looking for the tripwires, but not the physical ones. Corporate mercenaries, particularly those contracted by the syndicate Elijah was investigating, favored non-lethal, high-containment solutions, kinetic nets, sonic emitters, flashbang arrays. They wanted her alive, or at least intact enough to interrogate, just as they had Elijah. She spotted the first anomaly 40 meters to the northeast, nestled high in the crotch of a cedar tree. It was a sophisticated optical sensor array, no larger than a thumb, painted with chameleon coating. Its lens was aimed directly at the tent flap. If she approached the tent, the camera would confirm her identity and the ambush would be sprung. Instead of disabling it with an explosive charge, the predictable response of a panicked operative, Sarah pulled a specialized emitter from her pack. It was a tiny device designed to mimic the electromagnetic pulse signature of a localized lightning strike, but contained to a highly focused beam. She calibrated the trajectory, accounting for the humidity and the slight atmospheric distortion. Click. A microscopic, invisible pulse of energy shot upward. The sensor array instantly shorted, its sophisticated optics reduced to slag, its communication link fried. No sound, no light, no residual energy signature, just silence. One down. She moved clockwise, navigating the dense undergrowth. Her mind raced not with fear, but with calculation. If Marcus had 3 men on observation posts, he likely had a command center, probably a small reinforced structure or vehicle hidden further back, deep enough to run high-power comms without alerting Elijah's primitive gear. Her goal shifted: neutralize the observers, bypass the immediate trap, and locate the command structure. The data, Elijah's documentation, was the real prize, and Marcus would keep that close. 40 minutes crawled by, each second stretched by the excruciating demands of micro-movement and constant threat assessment. She discovered the second observation post, a heavily camouflaged sniper nest overlooking the clearing from the west. The sniper, likely bored and confident in his high ground advantage, had made a critical mistake. He was running a low-power, localized thermal blanket to mitigate the cold, but the exhaust vents were poorly shielded. Sarah detected the faint, specific heat signature of the exhaust fan, a telltale sign of professional laziness. She didn't engage the sniper directly. She deployed a small, insect-like drone, a microscopic quadcopter that flew silently using layered piezoelectric propulsion. It carried not a weapon, but a neurodisruptor payload, a focused burst of infrasound designed to induce vertigo and nausea without leaving physical evidence. She hovered the drone precisely above the sniper's position and triggered the burst. Through her high-gain audio pickup, she heard a muffled, sudden retching sound, followed by the heavy, sickening thud of a rifle dropping onto soft earth. The sniper was neutralized, temporarily incapacitated, his sense of balance destroyed. He wouldn't be reporting anything for hours. 2 down. The third observer was the hardest to locate, positioned deep in the brush on the south edge, providing overwatch for the extraction route. He was using passive optics and seemed to be relying purely on visual confirmation. This meant he was likely the highest-ranking mercenary, the one tasked with giving the final go signal. Sarah approached him from the flank, using a ravine hidden by thick ferns. She moved with the fluid grace of a predator, closing the distance until she was mere feet away, the scent of stale sweat and gunpowder strong in the humid air. She could hear his labored breathing, the slight shift of his clothing as he adjusted his posture. She didn't use a knife or a firearm. She used her hands, trained to deliver precise, non-lethal pressure point strikes. Her specialty was rendering targets unconscious instantly, silently, and without physical damage that might trigger an adrenaline dump or leave obvious marks. One swift, brutal movement, her forearms snapped across his throat, collapsing the larynx just enough to cut off air supply without fracturing bone, simultaneously driving her knee into the solar plexus. The man convulsed once, a silent, rattling gasp trapped in his throat, and then went limp. Sarah lowered his heavy body gently to the ground, securing his weapon and his comms unit, a vital piece of intelligence. 3 observers neutralized. Total time elapsed, 58 minutes. Total noise generated, 0. She stood at the edge of the clearing again, the heavy humidity pressing in. Marcus was expecting a panicked charge, a desperate sprint toward the tent. He was expecting the sound of gunfire or the activation of the perimeter alarms. He had received nothing but silence, which to a mind like Marcus's was far more terrifying than noise. Sarah's value wasn't just in her ability to fight, it was her ability to control the narrative, to dictate the terms of engagement before the enemy even realized the game had started. She had just demonstrated, through the absolute void of information coming from his perimeter, that she was operating on a level of sophistication that rendered his conventional trap useless. Now she needed to send him a personal message. She approached the main tent but did not go inside. She circled it slowly, noting the hidden pressure plates beneath the soil near the zipper, the final, lethal trigger designed to incapacitate anyone who entered. She found the primary surveillance feed, a tiny, highly concealed camera lens embedded in a rock near the tent's base, wired directly to Marcus's command center. She knew that Marcus, secure in his hidden location, was currently staring at a live feed of the empty, silent clearing, wondering why his perimeter hadn't activated. Sarah dropped to one knee, directly in front of the camera lens. She took off her glove slowly, revealing the complex layered scarring on the back of her hand, a specific, recognizable pattern of injury sustained during a past operation Marcus had overseen. This scar was her signature, her history with the corporation. She didn't make a sound. She simply stared directly into the lens for a slow, agonizing count of 10 seconds. Her eyes, usually hard and focused, held a cold, unwavering intensity that promised retribution. She wanted Marcus to see not just the threat, but the identity of the threat. She wanted him to know that the variable he dismissed had returned, infinitely more dangerous than he could have anticipated. Then, with meticulous care, she produced a single, highly specialized piece of equipment from her pouch, a miniaturized proprietary data disruptor designed to burn out specific memory banks on corporate-grade servers. This device was not for the mercenaries, it was for the data. She placed the device delicately on the rock next to the camera. It was a symbolic gesture, a corporate calling card. This device was worth millions, traceable only to the highest echelons of black market intelligence, echelons Marcus knew Sarah had access to. She then pulled out the comms unit she had taken from the neutralized perimeter guard. She didn't turn it on. Instead, she used a small tool to reprogram its internal gyroscope and frequency emitter, turning it into a localized, high-power jamming signal. She set it to broadcast a specific, non-random stream of white noise, a frequency associated with a failed operation Marcus had tried to cover up years ago. She placed the reprogrammed comm unit on top of the data disruptor. It was a package deal, a promise and a threat. I have neutralized your perimeter. I know who you are and where you came from. And I am coming for your data. She stood up, pulling her glove back on. She had broken the trap without firing a shot, turning the entire clearing into a silent, neutralized zone. The only remaining threat was Marcus himself, and the captured, sedated Elijah inside the tent. She looked toward the tent one last time. Elijah was the bait, but he was also the key. She could not rush in. She had to wait for Marcus's reaction. The absence of noise was her weapon, and she intended to let the silence drive Marcus to panic, forcing him to break cover and reveal the location of his command center and, more importantly, the storage of Elijah's vital, damning evidence. Sarah faded back into the dense undergrowth, her movement erasing any trace of her presence. She left behind only the crushing, psychological weight of absolute silence and two specific, highly technical items sitting next to a dead camera lens, a terrifying testament to a superior authority that had just seized control of the operation. She knew Marcus was watching that dead feed, his corporate confidence evaporating as the crushing realization dawned. He hadn't caught a variable, he had activated a ghost, and that ghost was coming for justice, armed with the precise knowledge of how his entire world was constructed and how easily it could be dismantled. She was the counter-algorithm, and now the hunt for the command center had begun.